Okay, hello and welcome to this session on pandemics. I'm James Gallagher from the BBC News website, and I'm going to moderate this discussion. So we're going to have a bit of a chat first and then some Q&A at the end, so feel free to save up some questions as you go along. Now, from my point of view, pandemics are some of the biggest stories that I cover. Where both Zika, Ebola virus have been huge stories for the BBC News over the past couple of years. And I know it's something that everyone on this panel has a really vested interest as well. So could we just go down the line and introduce ourselves, just briefly?
I'm Laurie Garrett, Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations.
My name is Paul Stoffels. I'm Chief Scientific Officer for Johnson & Johnson, heading the R&D in the company.
Hello, I'm John Watson. I'm the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at the Department of Health in London with a responsibility in the area of health protection, including things like emergency preparedness and response.
I'm Andrew Whitty. I'm a Chief Executive Officer of GlaxoSmithKline.
Now, pandemics are obviously something by definition that pose a threat to the whole world's health. Well, you just want to start us off. Has the threat changed over time? Are we more at risk of pandemics than ever before?
So, hi, everybody, and we're going to have a really calm, laid-back conversation here about apocalypse. So there's two answers to your question. The first is what has changed and what has not changed. What unfortunately has not changed is the nature of the response to outbreaks when they do occur, which is to say, first of all, they get detected quite late in the game. The world draws its attention to the problem quite late in the game. We never have a point-of-care diagnostic, so we never have an ability to tell who's infected and who's not. And even more importantly, from the standard of epidemiology, we never know who historically was infected. So we're unable to establish trends and figure out who's at risk and how it's spreading on any rapid scale at all. We always see a range of fear that goes from nonchalance to out-and-out hysterical panic. We always see a failure to mobilize politically. And generally, when things do mobilize politically, they do so in the self-interest of the specific country or government. We never have treatment, we never have a cure, and we rarely have a vaccine in a timely fashion, and we rarely have sufficient collaboration and exchange of data and information to allow what everyone finds to be pooled and move the situation in a radically faster manner. What has changed? Well, in part because of climate change, and we can go into that in detail if you're interested, but also increased urbanization of human population, increased travel of human population, and increased encroachment and damage of wildlife habitats. We are, in fact, seeing an increase in both the numbers of outbreaks, so the frequency is up, the F, if you will, and also the severity when they do emerge is potentially far greater. And I mean, I would just say on the aerosolized side, the worst case scenario would be an airborne human-to-human contagion. We're now monitoring almost every day at least 6 different forms of influenza that have the potential to be extremely dangerous, all of which so far have failed to do human-to-human transmission, but have shown themselves to be extremely lethal when an individual does get infected from an animal host, whether it's a bird or swine or what have you. And that's very worrying.
Paul, let's continue. Let's go down the line on this theme about is the pandemic threat actually increasing? It's a good way to start this debate. I mean, we can reel them off really quickly. Ebola, Zika, yellow fever, SARS, MERS, coronavirus, about these new emerging threats of viruses that get a lot of people worried. Are we just detecting more of them, or is there something fundamentally changing?
There is something fundamentally changing, is urbanization and global movements of people. There is an extreme fast movement of people all around the world today. And if you look at cities like Kinshasa, I lived in Kinshasa 25 years ago, there were 6 million people. Today there are 12 million people. Almost 1/3 of the population lives in a city. And you have that all over the world. And those people, there are parts of that population who travel across the world. And that's why the acceleration of epidemics happened. There is also, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, no healthcare systems which have followed that evolution on providing healthcare at a level where you can, what Laurie was saying, having diagnostic laboratories, having healthcare infrastructure to diagnose early. What we have seen in West Africa with Ebola, it was diagnosed far too late through the healthcare system as an Ebola epidemic with a lack of capabilities and insights. So I think the risk of pandemics have gone up significantly. It's not to cause panic, but the reality is that the world has changed over the last 20, 30 years in a way that the risk is going up.
John, obviously you have to prepare for them, any of these pandemics arriving in the United Kingdom. Do you see the threat increasing?
I do. I think I agree with many of the comments that we've just heard. It's certainly the case that the way in which the globe has changed has accelerated, and in the last 20, 30 years has changed perhaps more than ever before. And the increase in the population, the increase in urbanization, the amount of travel around the world, all contributing to increased risk of mixing, increased risk of spread. And so I do think that that's right, and it is therefore all the more important that we are prepared and ever preparing ourselves for this. I think Laurie's quite right that influenza is a really very good example of something where the risk is ever present, and it remains top of the list in the UK and in many other countries as a future pandemic risk, and something that it's important that we're detecting what's happening and the emergence of new viruses. So yes, I think it is increased, and therefore all the more important that we are ever focusing on preparedness and how we will respond.
We'll come to some of those issues. So, but Andrew, is it going to be 3-0 or 4-0? Is the risk increasing?
I think I'd share exactly the view you've heard. I mean, it certainly feels like it's increasing. And, there is, no surprise, increase in diversity of the risk. So I would obviously agree that flu is very high on that list, but there are now, a growing number of maybe a dozen other pathogens which, for the first time, you might articulate a good case to say they could emerge and they could spread into some sort of global risk where maybe 20, 30 years ago you wouldn't have done because of the urbanization dynamic and
so
travel
which
dynamic.
infections might?
Well, things like MERS, hemorrhagic fever, these sorts of Zika. I mean, I think 20 or 30 years ago, Ebola is a great example. Ebola is not new, not newly identified, but historically very contained within low transit regions of the world, tended to burn out within the region before it moved, and certainly never really reached into very significant travel lanes. And, I think the last outbreak got us very close to that situation. And I think the fortunate thing, repeatedly, is that none of these outbreaks have really combined super high virulence with very easy transmission, particularly not in a Western environment or in a more sanitized environment. But those are not two bases on which to buy your insurance policy, I don't think.
Okay, let's segue perfectly into Ebola because, 40 years ago it was detected for the first time. And what we've seen since then, as Andrew was describing, is relatively quite small outbreaks, a few hundred at most. And, starting a couple of years ago, we had the world's largest ever outbreak of Ebola. It wasn't even the world's largest, it was larger than all the others combined. 11,000 people died, nearly 30,000 people were infected. So I think
we don't know how many were infected.
If you add together the suspected, the confirmed, and the probables together, you get to 29,000-ish. Laurie, I was just curious, when did you first realize that Ebola outbreak was different to those that had gone before?
Yeah, I wrote the history of the 1976 first known Ebola outbreak, and then, like Paul, I was in the Kikwit 1995 epidemic, and then I went to Sierra Leone and Liberia in 2014. I started writing and pleading with authorities at WHO, in my own government, saying this is not a normal Ebola outbreak. The moment I saw evidence that there were people sick in Conakry, just to remind everybody, we're talking about 3 West African, very small countries: Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia. Each of them is typical of much of Africa in that the capital city is also the largest population center and has a disproportionate share of the population, but that most of the people who live in the city have relatives and households outside in the countryside and do a lot of going back and forth. And each of those big capital cities has an international airport and is a point of trade with the rest of the world. We had never before seen Ebola reach general population exposure in a major urban center. I mean, Kikwit had 450,000 people, but it was utterly, completely cut off from the rest of the world. There was never a moment in Kikwit where you could reasonably expect that this could globalize, this could turn into a larger phenomenon. But unfortunately, the first cases of people dying in the streets of Conakry, literally dying in the street, were in the 3rd week of March 2014. But at that time, the official position of WHO, and I'm sorry to say of our American Centers for Disease Control, was that it looked like they had all the chains of transmission figured out. The epidemic was under control. They could wind down and start leaving town. And in fact, precisely the opposite was happening. It had already gone to 3 countries. There were already multiple chains of transmission, and it was already urbanized in 2 cities at least by that point.
I'm just going to go to John. Was there an air of complacency, and I suppose this includes all health agencies, Public Health England included, of complacency around Ebola?
I mean, I understand you picked Public Health England from that point of view. Of course,
you can include a World Health Organization and talk about PHE specifically.
I think we need to get some perspective. This was an absolutely dreadful epidemic. It was a tragedy, and you've given the figures. It was awful. There were many people who did terrific and really excellent things in Ebola to deal with it. The citizens of the countries concerned, and many who lost their lives fighting it. Non-governmental organizations of from various places did a marvelous job. Workers from countries all around the world who went and helped in that part of the world. And industry in the way they came together to work on trying to get new treatments, new vaccines. I don't think we should forget that. Nevertheless, I think Laurie's quite right that the business of identifying that there really was a problem, and a problem that was going to get out of control and needed urgent and rapid dealing with, that wasn't recognized sufficiently quickly, and the story is now well known. I think the really important thing now is, and I think this is happening, is that the bodies involved, particularly some of the international bodies like WHO, but also governments around the world, have looked carefully at Ebola, what happened, why things went wrong, and look to try to ensure that we are able to do it better next time.
Just really interesting, another question for you. When did you choose to act? When did you decide that things had needed to change in the UK to prepare for Ebola coming in? Things like airport screening was introduced. Obviously, there were special centres set up in case an infected patient arrived here. So when did it really come across your radar? When did you decide you needed to prepare?
I can't remember the timelines exactly, but I think that the balloon went up really quite early, and that the nature of the response in the UK was really a twofold response. It was one, because of our association particularly with Sierra Leone and links that we already had, to be looking there to A, understand better what was happening, and B, see what it is that we could and should sensibly be doing. But as soon as that realization came that this was an issue that was going out of control, and bodies like Médecins Sans Frontières were being very vocal in their comments that this was the case, then of course it's for a government like Britain's and any other government to be saying, okay, also, what does that mean for us? And are there any things that we should be doing here by way of preparation? And that's when we began looking.
Now, at the start of this outbreak, there was no drug to change the course of the disease. There was no vaccine to prevent against it. Andrew, you were probably lucky in the sense that you didn't quite have one on the shelf, but you had most of an Ebola vaccine. Can you just describe the process that you went through? Because it was quite extraordinary.
So we'd been working collaboratively with NIH, actually. So for many years, NIH in the US had been focusing on trying to stimulate research into some of the rarer but potentially pandemic threat viruses. Ebola was one of them, and we'd had a collaboration with them through a company that we'd acquired some time earlier, and we'd continued that collaboration. When Ebola became essentially notified, or the priority became clearer from WHO, we were at the stage of animal experimentation, quite advanced animal experimentation, but not human exposure. And we were obviously using lab-scale technologies at that point. We moved forward obviously in collaboration with the regulators, both FDA and EMA, to accelerate the development, and from about, well, I guess WHO called it in June, July, by January we deployed the first doses to Sierra Leone for vaccination into a trial of essentially healthcare workers, which was deemed to be the right response in terms of how you can develop the vaccine and also make an impact on the disease epidemic at the same time. To do that, though, it's important to understand, right? I mean, the companies don't have spare factories lying around just waiting for a vaccine to be put in there. So we took the decision to defer the development of a dengue vaccine to make space in certain units of our facilities for Ebola. We deferred the development of a RSV vaccine, which is probably the one big widespread non-pandemic virus that needs to be dealt with, and so far has no vaccine worldwide. And by the end, we were very close to making the decision to reduce manufacture of rotavirus vaccine, which we never did do, but would have created a very difficult situation of you can either have Ebola vaccine or you can have rotavirus vaccine. And obviously rotavirus vaccine alongside pneumococcal vaccine is probably responsible for the reduction in child mortality in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 10 years. So that's basically what happened. I think if you look back at that, there are a bunch of things which could have been done differently. There could have been a lot more support for development of the vaccine through to certainly the end of phase 1 human trials, long before the epidemic even surfaced. There could have been all of the work done to optimize the scale up so that we could have scaled up more quickly to more volume. We could have avoided having a debate at the WHO in September on what the design of a clinical trial should be for a pandemic vaccine, which both Paul and I were in the room for, and it's a little weird to be in the middle of a pandemic and people want to debate what the trial should look like. All of those things could have been streamlined in the process.
Paul, do you want to pick up there?
Yeah, it could have gone much better. I was involved, as Laura was saying, not involved, but I worked in Kikwit for a while where that epidemic happened. And I have a little different opinion than Laurie on the risk of that epidemic. It was luckily contained in a hospital, and the WHO had at that moment a fast intervention team who came to a hospital, put a big ring around the hospital.
With MSF.
With MSF, yeah, you had the whole team there, very quickly got control and knew who was infected. 95% of the people died, they were buried, and then the epidemic was over after 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. That was lacking, the fast response was lacking in West Africa. But Kikwit is only 500 kilometers from Kinshasa. If at that moment a patient would have been transported to a clinic in Kinshasa, we would have had a totally different epidemic also at that moment back in '95. We had a similar program as what Andrew was alluding to, collaboration with the NIH on basic research. And we had been working for 10 years on how can we protect, first of all, the healthcare workers community for the long term. How can we get to an Ebola vaccine which is protecting for the long term so that those who see the patient first in the hospital are not the first victims? And in previous epidemics, and the first was discovered in Yambuku by Peter Piot and his team. It was because 4 nuns died, yeah? And there was a canary in the coal mine. The same in Kikwit. Why was the epidemic showing up? And we knew about it because nuns died who were working in the hospital, and that was reported through their channels in Europe, and that's how very quickly people knew that we had a, well?
There were no nuns in that hospital. That was not a Catholic hospital. I was there.
In Kikwit, I worked there, so we will do a bit, well? We wanted the Italian nuns, anyway.
Oh, the Italians, right?
Yeah, the Italian nuns were there, yeah? Okay. I did surgery with them for months, so I know very, very well. That led to us working for a long time on a prime boost, heterologous prime boost, where we could get short-term protection, long-term protection. And when the epidemic came about, we accelerated that. And today we have 2 million vaccines, both from the prime and the boost produced. A few thousand now, more than 1,000 people we have been testing. But will we be ready for the next one? I don't know, because the infrastructure hasn't followed to be able to implement the next epidemic. WHO has left for a large part the Ebola epidemic, while we are still, let's say, involved in making sure that we get the vaccines approved now, work with the European, the FDA, and the WHO to a certain extent on how can we get emergency use approval to make sure the next time around we have these vaccines available. That's not good for a healthcare infrastructure in the world to prevent the next 15. We need to get organized in a way that every participant in this system, from the NIH, from the WHO to the large research institutions in the world, to the industry, and to the healthcare communities in the world, that we get organized for early detection, prevention, vaccination, and eventually what didn't happen in this epidemic is also therapy, because therapy, you don't get overnight either. So point of care is not there yet. Well, we got one in the meantime developed and approved, but who is distributing it? Absolutely nobody. Yeah. So
in terms of vaccine development, what do you think needs to change?
Well,
do we need to move away from only developing a vaccine once you've reached the point that we're in the middle of a pandemic and actually have more on-the-shelf solutions?
There is now a collaboration ongoing between industry, governments, and institutions on can we set up a mechanism where we collaborate on early research, bringing it up to proof of concept, or at least to first in human, so that when there is when there is a crisis, vaccines are available to a certain point, scaled up at least to the point that you can vaccinate a few 10 or a few 100,000 people, and have a clinical trial mechanism that you can go fast and deploy these. As Andrew was saying earlier, in peacetime you have to prepare for war, so that a number of these high risky viruses, they get prepared with vaccines, diagnostics and therapeutics up to the point that we are ready to tackle them when they are there within a matter of weeks or months rather than a matter of years.
So, Andrew, GSK, what would you need in order to do that?
Well, so what we need is a priority from government and WHO and multilateral agencies to essentially sign up to a long-term plan to, first of all, put in place a governance structure and a network of capabilities. These capabilities, particularly the early phase, all exist, but they're not necessarily aligned or deployed with a single mission in mind. The mission here, I think, should be to take a dozen potentially predictable pandemic pathogens to a stage of end of phase 1 human trials, which is about as far as you can probably get without a pandemic, because you obviously need high exposures to really know what the ultimate profile of the vaccine is. You could do those things. I think we need that kind of research scale-up activity going on. I think the industry should engage in that on an open basis, on a no gain, no loss basis. I don't think anybody should view this as a profit-making venture. It shouldn't be holding up people's commitment to this. And we should be putting in place a very comprehensive plan around how do you act in a true pandemic. So, you know, how do you we talk about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of doses, which is exactly what you can do in the first phase, and is exactly what you might rely on for a ring vaccination strategy on a pandemic which you get to in time. But if you're really talking about a true pandemic, you need billions of doses. And I was saying to people earlier, there aren't billions of glass vials in the world. There certainly aren't billions of dose capacity to fill those vials in the world. That is a massive issue. When airports, in most national pandemic crises plans, the first thing they do is shut the airport. Well, if your factory is in the country where they shut the airport, how are we going to move the vaccine? I mean, really nobody is thinking about that, other than somehow the military are going to help fix this. Well, maybe they will, but it's that kind of really comprehensive, thought-through approach on a global basis. What tends to happen in these, certainly my experience of the last 3 or 4, is very quickly the countries start to think about themselves, and they start to disengage from the truly multilateral collaborative approach. And if anything, then the multilateral agency gets the blame for not being able to somehow corral the horses. But actually it's the horses that own all the resources. And that's something which really needs to be thought through. And it is I mean, you know, I don't think any of us should be sat here saying no effort's been made. There is a lot of reflection gone on. I think there's been 8 lessons learned reports at least into Ebola. And there is the beginnings of a move towards commissioning a new way of working for the next time, but it's a bit slow, it's a bit cumbersome, and there is a bit of an attrition against it. So each time you roll forward, some of the good ideas get ditched, because actually people's memories start to fade a little bit. Maybe there are more important things to spend the money on in the short run. Maybe the people who are around in the crisis aren't around anymore, and you know, all of those natural phenomena start to wear away at the lesson learned in the crisis. And I think from where we sit, we've been pushing very hard on at least the industry side of this network, the industry NIH type of collaborative space, the technical planning that's required to try and make sure people don't forget this, because we know when the next time it hits, the first people the government ring are the drug companies. And they expect us to be able to do back somersaults, you know, over a weekend and create things like magic out of nowhere. And it just can't be done. And the governments need to take much more accountability of the preparatory phase for this, on not just technology, but the governance of how it works, how they're going to work globally together, how they're going to deal with easy things. I'll give you a good example. Even today, after H1N1 and Ebola, there is no alignment on how to deal with liability of vaccination in a crisis. None. Because by definition, there can be no drug approval or vaccine approval of a pandemic vaccine. You're going to start deploying long before you have the standard of a registrable product. I can tell you that most sane boards of directors would say, don't go near that proposition because you're going to bankrupt the company. And that's the kind of thing where governments are repeatedly falling short in their obligation to plan for the future.
John, I suppose it comes to you. Does there need to be more planning? You're one of these government agencies that's protecting the nation's health.
Right. Well, firstly, I think there's so much that has just been said that I would agree with, and in particular, the idea about looking at known threats and looking at the development of vaccines and taking them as far as it's sensible to do is something that certainly the government of this country has looked at and has put money where its mouth is on that and started things moving forward. It may not be as fast as Andrew and colleagues may wish, but it's considerably more, and I think more sort of forward-looking than for many other countries around the world. One of the difficulties, though, is that we just don't know what's going to come. It's sensible to plan for those that are perhaps the more likely, but we don't know. One of the things that is really very likely to come again is flu. And it's sensible that we prepare on flu. There are a number of ways in which that's done, and one I mentioned is the Global Action Plan on Pandemic Influenza Vaccines, which is a mechanism overseen by WHO to try to support the development of seasonal influenza vaccine production around the world, particularly in low and middle income countries, so as to try to enable the capacity in the event of a flu pandemic to be there, to be able to produce the right kinds of quantities of pandemic vaccine that could make a difference in the face of a pandemic. But there are still an awful lot of challenges there, and one that I've just heard today is the one about glass for products. But we don't know what's going to come, and that's why we need global plans that are not individual pathogen specific, but are generic, and which start at that point of early intelligence and sharing of that intelligence, and then getting a response going, getting clear leadership on that response, having capacity behind that response, and being able to bring that to bear. And these are the kinds of things that the UK government is pushing hard on. Certainly very much engaged in the discussion about the reforms of the World Health Organization to, we hope, end up with a global leadership on these issues that can be more effective in the event of a further threat.
Laurie, I might be giving you an open goal here. Are we fixating on vaccines when there should be far more solutions to preventing pandemics?
I mean, it's quite natural that we look for the technological solutions that we know. So vaccines have been wondrous. And so there's a tendency to immediately ask, how quickly can we have vaccines? I would just add to Andrew's list of what we don't have enough of to possibly do global scale. When you're talking about influenza, we still make them on chicken eggs, and they have to be chickens that are known to not harbor bacteria. And so actually the first thing you run out of are chicken eggs. There just aren't enough out there. But if you really go through the list of what matters in a timely fashion, let me just remind you, in the case of Ebola, the first person to die was a little boy in a village of Meliandou, Guinea, and he died right after Christmas 2013. And WHO didn't declare a state of public health emergency of international concern until August 8th, 2014. So nearly 9 months of death, nearly 9 months of horror before there's even a state of emergency. The bulk of all global mobilization, everything from the United States and UK military forces to accelerated support for Save the Children and constructing the quarantine units and so on, all of that largely came in October, November, and December of 2014. Liberia's epidemic, we now know, peaked on September 23rd, 2014. So in other words, Liberia took care of Liberia. And I think that's a very important thing to consider. How did they do that? They didn't have any technology. There wasn't a miracle drug that suddenly appeared, a vaccine, nothing. It was social mobilization on a scale that was unprecedented for the people of Liberia and for most people in most of the world. And they mobilized in ways that, I would ask John if London could, if faced with the same set of problems. I mean, it turned out it involved everybody at village level with village political leaders, which were called chiefs, knowing that it was the folks coming back from the cities and revisiting the villages who were reinfecting the villages over and over and setting aside quarantine sites and saying, when you come in from the city, you have to stay in this building over here or this hut over here until the chief says it's safe, because you can't infect the whole village all over again. And literally, it was that kind of, could have been done during the plague in the 14th century approaches that stopped the spread. And I think we have to be very, we have to look at the hubris factor when we think about epidemic preparedness. We don't have global governance of epidemics right now. You could say what you want about WHO this and the pharmaceutical industry that and the NGOs this, but we don't actually have governance. If we had another major outbreak that caused great fear across the world, we would see the same chaotic responses again and again and again. What would it take to come up with the kind of governance that really matters? Well, if something different than what's going on right now in my country, and let me, because I'm not in the United States, you may not have exhaustively heard this news, but, Zika is now on our shores, not lapping at our shores, but we actually have mosquitoes carrying Zika in Florida now. We've actually, my city, New York, just this week, a child was born with microcephaly caused by Zika. Puerto Rico is almost at 25% of the population infected with Zika, and yet our Congress went on summer recess not to return until mid-September, having not agreed to vote a single penny for Zika research, control, mosquito abatement, nothing. They let it all go into partisan bickering, and then said, let's take all the so-called leftover Ebola money, which is all committed for health security. That's the what do you do in peacetime versus wartime that Andrew Whitty brought up. It was all meant to be building infrastructures in Africa and elsewhere to protect all of us, regardless of what country we live in, against the next outbreak. And instead, Congress said, take that money, spend it on Zika for America. The White House said, no, we're committed to protecting all over the world. Total logjam. Result, here's our mosquito season. Welcome, America. Here come the Zika.
John, did you want to come in?
Only to pick up on a comment that you made earlier when you mentioned my name. I certainly think that if Paul or Andrew, in the event of a new epidemic, have got an effective drug or an effective vaccine, I'm going to say, yes, please, and more. But I also recognize that if you look back at some of the major pandemics in the last 10 or 15 years around the world, SARS, indeed Ebola, that they occurred and came to an end in the absence of either a specific vaccine or specific medicines. And that was because of the combination of clinical work, clinical care, public health activity, and, as you say, social mobilization. And I think we need to recognize that that is not going to become less important, and that we need ways in which we can effectively ensure, effectively lead, effectively organize those aspects of the response to pandemic threats that come in the future.
So how do you make that better so that the response is better than it was in Ebola?
Well, I go back to some of my comments earlier, which is that you start at the beginning by ensuring that you've got a system around the world of early detection, and to do that, among other things, we need to help countries strengthen their infrastructure around surveillance to be able to do that, the communication systems, the collaborations between organizations. But combined with that is the leadership that's required and the support for that leadership that's required from countries around the world.
Can
Now,
I ask John a question?
Go on briefly. I wanted to talk about Zika if we can. And so almost immediately after Ebola was in decline, Zika really emerged. Paul, have you noticed any lessons learned from Ebola that are being applied in Zika? Are we getting better?
Are we getting better?
49 countries.
Yeah, it's. I was just wanting to go back for 1 second to don't forget we had HIV 25 years ago, and
35.
last 35 years ago, 35 years ago, and last week at the AIDS conference in Durban was declared that every year another 2 million people get infected. For most of the countries, Southern Africa, that led to 15 to 20 years decrease of life expectancy on a country base, yeah, and still fighting our way up to try to get people survive with HIV and prevent new ones. Zika is in a massive number of countries. It's known since less than 12 months, so it's known since a long time, but nobody knew that it had that type of effect on people. It's in a very particular population, which is where it is risky, is women of childbearing potential. So developing a drug for a vaccine or even a drug for that population takes even more challenges because of the care you have to take on the challenge of pregnant women and new products being probably a risk for pregnant women, so the development part. Have we learned any lesson? One thing what I'm positive about is that in the meantime, we have learned to upscale new technologies very fast. Yeah? And I think new vaccine technologies, whether Ebola was a very negative experience, the new vaccine technologies, they can deliver and the new techniques which have been developed can deliver fast. Could it be developed fast? Yes, I think by the end of the year there will be a few vaccines which will show protection for Zika, yeah, in maybe 100%. If you look at the recent literature in animal models, you will get 100% protection if you vaccinate. The development of those is a whole different question on how that is going to be done. First of all, I don't think, but there might be some challenge models. In many diseases we can use challenge, like in influenza, RSV, we can use challenge. If you can't do a challenge model, you have to go to a full-blown efficacy model. That means that you have to go in the regions where there's an epidemic before you can do that. On large populations, you have to need a lot of safety. So it all depends on how you're going to look and how big the crisis is. But it will take several years before a new vaccine will be there. Did we learn anything? Yes, a lot of scientific. I think there will be the diagnostics much faster than before. We'll have vaccines much faster than before, but the development will be a challenge to even try to prevent the Puerto Ricans or the South Americans, the next 100 million people who are going to have a baby.
Andrew, does Zika just show us that actually you always have to expect the unexpected in pandemics, and there's only a certain extent to which you can prepare for them, because you can still be hit by something completely unexpected that you didn't think was going to cause a huge problem?
No, I think that's absolutely true. You know, whether Zika would have made that list if we'd actually been in the business of generating those, I don't know. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't.
I don't think so.
The fact that you can't predict everything, I mean, if you extend that logic, we shouldn't bother worrying about a mutated flu virus. Because I don't know when the next serious mutated flu virus is going to come along, because I don't know when and which one. Maybe we shouldn't worry about it. We're pretty sure there's going to be one, and so we do worry about it. And I think that to the extent to which we know a variety of dangerous pathogens exist, many of them are, for whatever reason, reasonably locked in their environment or have not been very transmissible among humans. So far, we could conclude, well, we don't know which of the 15 or 20 are going to break out, or why not, for reasonably small amounts of effort in the global scheme of things, why not create at least tools against those ones that we can predict? Now, maybe you cover 3 out of 4 possibilities and you don't cover the 4th, which is the thing that gets you, and we're all going to think, oh, damn, I wish we'd seen that coming. But I don't really see the logic of not trying to cover the real risk. I mean, it's a bit like saying I'm going to, in an insurance policy, you insure against the things you think are really, really likely, but you don't insure your house against a lightning strike. Actually, most people would insure the house against a lightning strike because it's a rare catastrophic event or whatever, that kind of analogy. And I think that's exactly the situation we're in at the moment. I think on Zika, it's a very different scenario to Ebola because everybody knows there's no treatment or vaccine anywhere close. And so actually, it's not testing the muscle that failed in Ebola.
And no diagnostic.
And nothing. There was nothing. So And what you've got is a kind of completely uncontained spread of a virus, which people kind of hope either we're going to come up with a solution sometime in the next few years, but it's years, not months.
That's right.
Or it burns its way out somehow, and the world becomes habituated to the virus without a catastrophic event, which hopefully is the outcome of all of this. But it's not testing the muscle that failed on Ebola at all. The Ebola situation was a much more acute, potentially, and it turned out to be containable, but it was a pandemic threat which for a prolonged period of time needed to be dealt with as a containment issue. And we could have been in a situation where we could have had better vaccine and other treatment options available so that if it had broken out, we could have protected ourselves better. We're not in that position on Zika.
May I add something? But what it's like winning the European Championship football with a team. Huh? If you want to do something fast and good, and you have with many different players from many different countries who play in different teams, at a certain point, if you let them play together, if they are not trained to work together, it takes a long time before they win. Yeah? And so that's what's happening here. You have, with different constituents, would all have to work together to get to a vaccine, to a product development for such a pandemic. If we develop a cancer drug today in our company, we can do it in 24 to 36 months, yeah? From first patient in to approved with the FDA. Why we should learn with that community on how can we develop products very, very fast, including all of the different governments, WHO, regulatory agents, what needs to be done. It needs a lot of preparation, but if you don't work together as a team at that moment when the crisis is there, there is no way you're going to win anyway, because it's a disorganized group of people who will shoot on the wrong goal. Yeah, so that is absolutely what's needed to be prepared.
Well, since there are people here in this audience from multiple fields of science, let me throw out a few other examples of what preparedness would look like. Hopefully, one or two of you run off and try to figure out answers. So I imagine a emergence of a microbial disease occurs in London, and the index case turns out to be a refugee or a person who has recently come from the Middle East. Are we prepared? What is the model for the education and communication to the British public regarding, no, this is not terrorism, no, you can't discriminate against every single migrant based on one having arrived who was sick? How do you counter the social response that feeds into a pre-existing narrative? This is what we've seen in every single epidemic, that the background pre-existing narrative that plays into public prejudice rises and becomes the narrative of the epidemic. And so there's a huge challenge for any sociology person, anybody who's involved in anthropology, behavioral sciences, is to try to figure out how do you prevent the background political and social narrative from coming into and interfering in the epidemic response. Another example. We know that the mosquitoes have been globalizing in part because of the nature of how we do containerized shipping in the world. And a lot of cargo sits exposed to rainwater and to mosquitoes on decks and then loaded into cargoes, into containers. And you have larvae inside the containers that then arrive at a ship, at a port of call thousands of miles away. Great question. How do you make shipping containers no longer environments that can allow such transmission of vectors? Another classic question. In the wealthy world, most of our entire mercantile system now is based on just-in-time delivery. You know you run a loser business if you have huge inventories, all right? So everything is about stocking your shelf today for the next 48 hours of sales, or metaphorically so. What do we do about just-in-time delivery in an economy when a pandemic hits? How do you make the food line continue? How do you make the chain of supplies and commodities to society continue when we've created a dependency on 24-hour cycles of delivery? Another classic one, probably the one that is most overriding in our conversation right now is how are we going to create sustainable financing for this institution that is very flawed called the World Health Organization? And how are we going to make sustainable financing that is far greater than what it gets right now with true buy-in by all the nations of the world, not these silly little assessments that they've not increased in 40 years, so that WHO actually has less income from its country base when adjusted for inflation than it did in the 1960s. We can't expect an institution to globalize and respond to an outbreak if we're not giving it any financial support. And yet, what would be the mechanism of finance? What do we think about the World Health Organization's call to create a several $100 million reserve fund controlled by the World Bank for outbreaks? And how can we create greater accountability for that money so that the world feels confident and sees WHO as a credible recipient of that cash?